Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second series of the Labour Future podcast. We haven't seen you for a while. My name's Brendan, and you'll see my colleague here, Joe.
Hi, Brendan. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, mate. We're all looking very dishevelled in the absence of a barber over the past while, but we'll get there.
We're doing all right. Not long now. Not long.
No. There's a roadmap out of this. So last time we had on some great guests. We had Ruth Smee, Gareth Snell. Who else? We have Stephanie Peacock came on. John Denham. Have I missed anyone out?
Martin Edinburgh.
Yes.
Vince Maple. A few different guests, all very good. So hopefully we'll get a few more of those in this series as well.
Yeah. Today, everyone, you've just got me and Joe because Joe's been working all day. I've been working and campaigning all day. And we didn't have time to find someone. So you're just going to have to put up with us for this evening's podcast. And we want to talk to you all about the first year of Keir. We are approaching that point where Keir Starmer has been the leader of the Labour Party now for nearly a year. I think he got elected on the 4th, wasn't it? 4th or 3rd of March?
4th of April. Yeah.
4th of April, sorry. God, see, just shows how the calendars just completely merged this year. So we want to go over what the first year's been like, what have the highs been, what have the lows been, what have the challenges been, and where we go from here. Obviously, we've got the big elections in May. So, Joe, I think we should go back to when he first became leader and those first few weeks and months when actually I think things look pretty good. We took a bounce in the polls. The government looked worried. He came out very strong. So let's just review that and see what people think of it.
Yeah, I think the first few weeks were very good indeed. I think Keir set out his stall to be seen as both competent, a details man in that sense, and also very constructive, showing that he's willing to work with the government. We're not just going to be not going to be just opposition for opposition's sake. We'll work with the government where necessary. We'll do grown-up politics. And I think that was the right approach. I mean, it's easy to forget how far behind in the polls we were. I think we were getting on for 20 points behind or somewhere around that at the beginning. And particularly on certain measures such as the economy, but also things like being a strong party. We were seen as, I think 4% of the public in one YouGov poll said that we were a strong party, whereas over 30% thought that the Tories were a strong party. And things like trustworthiness, we were kind of 13 points behind. So there's a lot of building trust, I think, and showing Labour as being capable that needed to be done. So I don't think we could have expected anything more from Keir in those first few weeks and months, actually, than actually showing those very, very basics of being a good leader. And I think he did a fantastic job. And you're right. I think there was a poll bounce. I think we got up to even pretty quickly, didn't we? Within a kind of month or two, it felt like we were right up there. So I think I can't criticise anything he did in those first few weeks and months. So I don't know if you've got a view on that, Brendan. If you share that view, you have a different take.
I mean, I think everyone knows I voted for Lisa Nandy in the leadership election. And of course, halfway through the campaign for the leadership, everything had to stop. Everything was then done remotely. All the hustings that were due to take place around the country were cancelled because of the virus. And Keir had to make his speech. I think it was from his own lounge when he won. He had the window behind him. It was pretty extraordinary. And I think for anyone coming into the role of leader of the opposition, the guy that's going to challenge Boris Johnson to become the Prime Minister, it was an extraordinary set of circumstances in which to become leader of the party. I was pleasantly surprised, I must admit, when Keir won. I thought, is a London MP who'd been quite vocal on the Remain campaign, well, he'd been the champion of the Remain second referendum cause, is this the right guy to win back the Red Wall and to rebuild our support in the North and Midlands and in Wales? And for those first few weeks, as you say, I was like, wow, yes, he is. The polls narrowed. And I think Keir, within about 6 to 8 weeks, I think he was pegging with Boris Johnson on the personal ratings for best person to be Prime Minister, strongest leader, most trustworthy, etc. And Boris was rattled in the House of Commons. He
Yeah.
kept referring to Keir as, oh, my learned friend, my lord, sort of trying to mock his legal credentials as he was Director of Public Prosecutions. And they were worried. And then we overtook the Tories. And so he did a very good job. I think he very quickly established Labour as a party that would act in the national interest. He wasn't going to score partisan points because we were all still learning about this virus. None of us, think we all know a lot now, but this time last year, we were all still going, oh, do we keep our distance? Are we allowed to shake hands? None of us really knew what was going on.
It was.
He did a good job.
It's an extremely strange time to obviously become leader, like you said. I mean, not being able to do the big speeches with kind of crowds of Labour supporters backing you, a kind of empty, silent House of Commons, which actually maybe worked in favour because Boris's kind of bluster got kind of found out a little bit with the kind of detailed, intrinsic kind of incisive kind of questioning, really. But on the whole, it's obviously a very, very difficult time to come in, and he did well by surrounding himself, with obviously Lisa Nandy as Foreign Secretary, Shadow Foreign Secretary, maybe one day Foreign Secretary. Like you said, she was one of the leadership candidates, and I also backed. And getting people like, as well as her, getting people like Claire Ainsley and Morgan McSweeney in his team, who clearly Morgan understands Labour and Claire really understands policy and the Red Wall, and has done a lot of work in that area with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So I was impressed with the people who came in and around him, and of course other members of the shadow cabinet as well. Some more in his mould, some a bit different. So I think that the team he built, the work that he did, set us in a kind of good, the kind of good foundation there. And I think that the big event, which really maybe was the moment where we kind of overtook the Tories, was around the Dominic Cummings affair. And I think the impression that the public got of Cummings and doing that kind of that press conference, really, wasn't it, at number 10 outside, what that kind of said around the Tories, and the fact that he tried to claim that he drove all those miles to test his eyesight with his kid in the car, and like the public are going, I'm not stupid.
No one's buying that.
You might be able to keep the job, but you're taken to a fool. So I think there was it was around that time when Keir was out of Johnson and things were looking good, and that continued, I think, through summer, although things leveled out a bit more, but continued through the summer. And I think we negotiated some pretty difficult positions through that summer, and what you might call the Tories playing their culture wars, and these kind of cultural issues such as the Black Lives Matter movement. There were a few bills going through the House of Commons, and there were a few other, obviously the statues with the Black Lives Matter movement was a big thing that the Tories jumped on, shamefully, I thought, to writing pieces around Churchill's statue. No one was talking about Churchill's statue being removed. It was absolutely ridiculous. There was no one in any position of credibility saying that was going to happen, but they played on it and they drew those divides. And I don't think Labour always gets everything right when it comes to these issues, but I think really focusing on the implementation of actual legislation that could make a change, like asking why the Lammy review hadn't gone through and been acted upon. So I think we did quite well during that period in terms of negotiating those kind of Tory traps, whilst also staying true to our values and backing the fight for racial equality. So I don't know how you feel about that period went, but I thought Labour kind of handled all those kind of issues quite well over the summer.
I'll jump to the Cummings aspect first. I think Labour was very, very good on that. We had, once again, this sort of image of Tories, elite, one rule for everybody else, one rule for them. And then the Prime Minister, giving so much political capital in defending Cummings throughout that period. He, almost everybody, Tory backbenchers, the whole of the opposition. And, we know there were some senior cabinet members now who were quite unhappy. They boycotted, of course, the whole of the GMB News over the course of the year. And he gave up a lot of power on that and gave up a lot of sway. And I think it showed really Boris's dependency on Cummings during that period. Cummings was the de facto prime minister. Boris was just the face of it. And by having him remain there, despite, breaking lockdown rules when they're imposing them on the rest of the country, was really quite something. On the Black Lives Matter protests, obviously the murder of George Floyd in America, it did send shockwaves around the whole world. And we saw protests in London and in other parts of the country, all over Europe, Asia, and all over the United States. There were grievances there that needed to be addressed. I think Keir was right to say that it was wrong to sort of make criminal damage and damage public buildings and public spaces, but at the same time, reflecting the fact that there are issues that need to be dealt with. We are underrepresented in, institutions in terms of minorities, in terms of women as well. With the issue of, women's place in society in recent weeks has, blown up over the terrible murder of that young lady was taken from Clapham Common. And so, yes, it was a challenging time. I think the Labour Party has got to, it's incredibly difficult for Labour because the Tories can easily do, culture wars, attacking heritage, attacking the nation, not very patriotic, and they can get away with it. We've got to demonstrate that we are a patriotic party because we know that's one of the issues why voters abandoned us in 2019, while at the same time dealing with those genuine grievances. And it's a very difficult line to tread because on the one hand, if you go too far one way, you get the sort of people we need to win back saying, we know Labour Party doesn't really care about Britain, they're ashamed of our history. And then if we don't deal with it in the true way and saying, actually, we need to accommodate these people with their grievances, their issues, their concerns and the discrimination, we're not true to our values. I think Keir on the whole has done the right thing. It has kind of died down a little bit as we've gone through the year, but I imagine it is going to raise its head again because, those injustices are still there. They haven't been dealt with just because the protests have stopped and, statues aren't being pulled. Well, they can't be pulled down now. You get 10 years in prison under Home Secretary Priti Patel's legislation. They have got to be dealt with at some point.
So I think that was a kind of a kind of difficult issue which he had handled well. And then that, like you say, that was kind of big during the summer. And as the summer went on, the focus became more around track and trace, I think, and the failure to deliver there, and local lockdowns. I think we saw the failure actually of centralisation and privatisation in England, particularly around the issues of contracts with Deloitte and other organisations where you couldn't share data. Didn't have that problem in Wales. It was run by local experts in Wales. In England, it was run by it was a kind of privately outsourced system. So I think there was a kind of a real failure there, which I'm not sure Labour quite managed to nail, the failure around privatisation and centralisation, and Tory failings in that regard around track and trace, partly because the Tories managed to badge track and trace as NHS, when actually it was being run largely by Serco and private companies. So I don't know about you, but I thought there were some missed opportunities in the summer for Labour to talk about, to really put some more pressure on the Tories there.
I agree, Joe. And I mean, where I am, just so people know, I'm down in Kent, and in the space of 6 weeks, we went from tier 1, tier 2 to tier 3 to a lockdown. And you had individuals struggle with the, I think we could have gone a bit stronger on government communication. I think, although we did land some strong blows there, I think we could have done better, particularly for businesses. because you're trying to run a small business and the government are changing the rules left, right, and centre by edict. It's incredibly difficult to keep up. On test and trace, you're absolutely right, and I can't remember what the figure is now. Billions of pounds have been wasted on this system that just doesn't work, and completely failed to do the testing and the tracing. Not to mention the hundreds of billions of pounds of cronyism. Let's call it actually what it is: corruption. If what had gone on over the past year in terms of contracts in this country had happened in an African or developing country, we would be calling it corruption. Imagine there are bits we don't know. There are probably other contracts or other arrangements that have been made that haven't yet come to light. And for Keir calling for the public inquiry to start as early as June, I think it's absolutely right. Because we've only found out, I think, the tip of the iceberg on what's actually gone on in the handling of this crisis. And we heard when Dominic Cummings appeared before the Select Committee this week, just gone. He described let people catch chicken pox. Chicken pox parties was a phrase that was used by the government. I mean, come on, this was a virus we knew sod all about, excuse my language, nothing about. And the government are sitting there contemplating letting that happen. I mean, come on, mental.
Yeah. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because when you look back, and this is something I want to mention as well, when you look back on things, we're accused of hindsight, and we know that Keir's accusations from Boris of being Captain Hindsight has cut through. I've seen polling that shows that has cut through in the red wall. So it's been very difficult because you're looking at going, Boris was telling everyone to shake people's hands. Boris wasn't shutting the borders quick enough, and all this is true. And we wasted all this money on track and trace, cronyism, all these issues you mentioned. And they're absolutely right. The problem is that the retort has been largely a lot of that is hindsight, and we needed these contracts signed and delivering PPE and so on, and we need to give track and trace a go. But I think that lets the government off for what was some pretty terrible decisions. I really hope the review that will happen next year, which will happen afterwards, which will be hopefully independent and not be, will kind of prove Keir right in a lot of this stuff. I think the other thing that goes to the heart of these contracts is the fact that the foundations of our economy have been basically blown away, largely through the last 10 years, but probably going back further, in terms of not being able to produce our own PPE at the drop of a hat, or, in terms of, I think 40% of the world's PPE was being made in China at the beginning of the crisis, 40% in one country in China. And supply chain, that's got huge supply chain issues there. So I think the failure, and of course on the vaccine, the Tories wanted to sell off, or they're happy for AstraZeneca to be sold off in 2014, and it was Ed Miliband who led the campaign against that. So I think there's a whole range of issues there relating to those contracts, the contracts themselves, but also behind why it was that we were signing contracts left, right, and centre for various things. Around the actual foundations of our economy and the failures over the last 10 years by the Tories, because we talk about the austerity failures of the Tories, we don't talk a lot about the kind of economic foundational economy failures of the Tories and the outsourcing, not just the outsourcing, but the offshoring. So I think there's a whole, I'd like to see a big a review which looks at all those issues, doesn't just look at the cronyism that we talked about, but looks at the last 10 years and the state of the economy and how that led to the situation we were in. So I think hopefully, although that some of those stories didn't come out till later in the year when the vaccine bounce was already happening, by the way, but there were some issues at the time around obviously track and trace not working, local lockdowns, why they were happening. I hope those will all come out in this review at the end. So I think, really important points. And I think towards the end of that period, I think Keir did well when he called for the circuit breaker. As soon as he saw that sage advice, he said, right, things are getting really bad. We need a circuit breaker. Let's get it done. I'm not sure why. I don't think he quite got as much credit as he should have done for that. But I think it was the type of politics that is needed on a consistent basis, getting ahead of the game. Can't be called Captain Hindsight if you're if you're ahead of the game. So some more kind of politics like that, I think would be useful. And I think at that point, that was a kind of high point. I think it's kind of been a year of two halves. I think we had that first 6 months up to the circuit breaker point, and then we had the second 6 months where, as we'll talk about in a second, we had the vaccine bounce and a few other things which could have gone a bit better. I don't know if that's a fair assessment.
I think one point you've touched on there, Joe, that I think is really important is this whole question of the past 10 years, not just on austerity, but the offshoring that's gone on, the fact that in so many of our strategic industries, we're countries that are not necessarily ones that share our democratic liberal values. Like you say, most of our PPE came from China. I remember reading in my local newspaper that design technology departments in secondary schools were volunteering, the students were volunteering to make the visors because there was a shortage. I mean, it says something when the country that started the Industrial Revolution is dependent on school children to make visors in the middle of a pandemic. And I think, we are such an interconnected world nowadays. I imagine pandemics or other viruses will probably be the norm. We may get others in the future. We don't know. None of us expected this one. So I imagine there will be others in the future. I think Labour, there is a huge agenda here that Labour could tap into on reviving manufacturing in this country. So we are absolutely sound and resolute in pharmaceuticals, etc. I think we also need to ensure that when, as part of the recovery from COVID, we've got the economy's in a right old mess at the moment, as we know. We need to grow our way out of it. And to do that, we need to see a revival in areas that actually produce good jobs, good wages, and grow the economy. And that means more manufacturing. So we need to look at bringing things back into this country. But I think your summary is absolutely right. And if Labour can tap into that, you can tap into jobs, you can tap into patriotism, and you can tap into Britain's role in the world as a country that's safe and secure because it's got control of its own key industries.
Well, it's three themes that we've seen early this year from Labour, which is patriotism, like you mentioned, being kind of pro-business and pro-growth and pro-jobs. Also this issue of security. Keir does talk about security a lot. He did it in his speech at Labour Connected in September. He mentioned the word security, and it's a realization that that the world is changing from a kind of direct line through this kind of like more and more liberal, more and more globalized society into people being a bit more cautious about what that actually means for people in their day-to-day lives. So I think that those issues of patriotism, pro-enterprise and security are key things. And that story that you've just told brings all those things together perfectly. And I think Keir started to do that in his Labour Connected speech, and he has a really good lines in there back in September about on the kind of opportunity and security side, making Britain the best place to grow up, the best place to grow old. And he talked about his values, compassion, opportunity, security, and fairness, and so on. So I think that was, a kind of good period, that period. But they're obviously much more, like you say, we could have done around the national story and the kind of economics and what kind of economy we need. But they're moving through. I think things. We had a difficult November, I think is the best way to put it. There was the anti-Semitism report. I personally think Keir handled that as best he could, but I know that there'll be some people listening to this podcast who disagree with that. I think it was very difficult, given what our former leader came out and said during an interview, not to take the action he took. But at the same time, I recognise that it was a kind of difficult period for the party and a period that kind of divided us slightly. And towards the end of that month, or it might have been very early December, there was the abstention vote on the third lockdown, which also created a bit of a clash, I thought, with the kind of constructive opposition that we'd been up to then. Even though we had a very valid points to make around the fact that the economic package wasn't strong enough, I think that kind of set us back slightly in terms of our image. I I don't know if you think that's a fair assessment of that kind of period of time.
I think so. I think that report, when it came out, every Labour member up and down the country and every Labour supporter read that report and its findings, should have been ashamed of themselves that this was our party, and one community, one group of people, in this case the Jewish community, felt that their party, that they, the Labour Party in was in some ways founded by many Jewish people in the country. Look at Ed Miliband's father, Ralph, Jewish guy, great intellectual thinker, core Labour guy, just one person. And for us to be in a position where we had, an independent report by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission into our party on racism is frankly appalling. And I think Keir, as you say, handled that in the best way he could. I know some of our listeners will think this is a wrong thing to say, but frankly, it was a shameful period in Labour's history. And, it was the public gave their view on that in the general election the year before. So, quite right, we've got to move on, we've got to deal with this, we've got to stamp it out. Not just that, we've got to stamp out every form of racism in the party and in the country too. And I think you're right, just jumping forward to that lockdown period. In my view, if you want to be a government, you've got to make a decision. You don't abstain, you make a decision one way or the other. That's my view. And I think if Labour wants to be in a position where it can challenge seriously in 23 or 24, whenever the election comes, we've got to show that we're a strong party, willing to make decisions and come down one way or the other. Sitting on your hands doesn't win elections.
On to the next kind of topic of conversation. We learned something there for Brexit. I think there was a learning from that. It was a learning from that vote on COVID that abstaining is not a good look. And I think Keir was absolutely right to back Johnson's deal. However bad Johnson's deal is, it was still better than no deal. And abstaining on an issue that big, I think, had its merits. So I think I think I don't know about you, I think we handled the Brexit situation right. It's a very, it's utterly shameful that the Tories would come back with what I thought was the worst deal in Theresa May's, then pushing through a deal which we're now seeing the repercussions of in terms of issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, fish rotting in lorries. It's not been a good couple of months, and the Tories at the moment are kind of getting away with it. But that doesn't change the fact that it was deal or no deal, and deal was better than no deal. So that's my take on Labour's Brexit stance. And Rachel Reeves, again, mentioned it before. She's done some fantastic work this year. She's done some fantastic work around Brexit as well. So yeah, that would be my kind of take on how we did there.
I agree. I think just specifically on the Brexit deal, I think Labour had to support it. The public in 2019 had abandoned Labour for two reasons. They didn't like our stance on Brexit, and they didn't like the position that our leadership was in. And so, we dealt with the first issue. We got a new leader. We had to then deal with the second issue, which was the public not trusting us on Brexit. So we were right to vote for it. Is the deal perfect? By no means is it perfect, as you say. I was a supporter of leaving the European Union, but at no point did I ever consent to part of our country, Northern Ireland, essentially being carved off and given part control to the institutions of the European Union. Our fishermen have not got the deal that they were hoping for. Wholly less than satisfactory arrangements there. And yes, of course, the customs arrangements, people are obviously at the moment adapting to the new systems, but I don't think the government was fair to give businesses in this country essentially 24 hours notice that its deal was the new terms on which we would be trading. The deal, was passed a few days before New Year's Eve, and we left on New Year's Eve, and businesses were left thinking, what on earth do we do? I think
absolutely, of course, right, which I think, sorry.
No, just going to say, and the other thing that Labour have got to be conscious of is this treaty, this deal with the European Union that we have is up for review in 4 years' time. 3 years' time now, sorry. And we will need to ensure that if we're the ones undertaking that review, we've got some clear parameters as to what we want to achieve. Do we want, as a party, to have closer alignment? Do we want to maintain the status quo? How do we deal with Northern Ireland? And that's what we need to be thinking about over the course of the next few years, because a lot of the polling is showing that, unfortunately, in those red wall seats, we're not making that progress as much as we ought to be. And I think part of that is because there is this legacy issue on trust. You know, we went into the 2017 election saying we respect the result, we should leave and get a good deal. And then we said, oh, hang on a minute, we want you to vote again. And so the public in those areas are rightly, you know, concerned about Labour. And if we want to build that trust and win back their support, we need to have a firm position for the next general election on this issue.
Sure, yeah, and I think, I mean, as someone who voted Remain, I respect the result of the referendum and would have liked a closer alignment with Europe than what we've got. I think the key thing for Labour is to be building on this deal rather than chucking it in the bin, or you know, or certainly not campaigning to rejoin, because I think that just opens up, you know, the amount of damage that would do would be quite incredible to the party and also to the country. I don't think that there's an appetite for more divisions, you know, just for the sake of, you know, for the sake of a kind of slightly stronger economy. I don't think many people would, even Remainers, would accept that kind of trade-off of another referendum for, you know, not that Remain would even win it. So I think it's got to be a very carefully put, you know, Brexit position in the next. Or won't be a Brexit position. We say Brexit's done. You know, it'd be the EU-UK trade and security relationship. So, you know, that'll be the framing of it in a kind of wider context, I imagine, in how our foreign policy and trade relationships are with the rest of the world. So, it'll go on in the background, possibly a chance to make a bit more noise about the kind of failures of the deal so far. But I think we probably need to give it a few months to see if these things settle down or not. And if there's still big problems in a few months. I mean, there are still 20 working groups, I think, or something like that, between the EU and the UK that are continuing. The negotiations are continuing. This isn't finished. It's still going on, you know. So it's you know, it's going to rumble on a bit.
We're going to jump now to just coming out of Christmas and the New Year. Just a few months ago, we were right the way into the third national lockdown, and we started off the new year with a leak on Labour's plan to become a more patriotic party. And the leak included making sure we were strong on defence, featuring the Union Jack as much as possible, the country's flag in our literature and when shadow spokespersons are speaking. And it caused a bit of a stir, didn't it? There was, certainly on social media, there were rumblings about this and people going, oh, you know, it's moving to the hard right because, you know, we've got the Union Jack in our party. And it was, you know, in the normal world, of course, most people regard it as a perfectly normal thing to be a bit patriotic. You know, we're all born here, we all love our country.
Yeah. I think there's some interesting stats around who feels pride in Britain, who doesn't. I think Tory Remainers feel more than 50% feel a lot of pride in Britain. Tory Leavers, it's the same. Labour Leavers, it's the same. Labour Remainers, a bit more, you know, they're kind of down to kind of early 30s. They're not, you know. So I think there's a kind of, obviously with the makeup of the Labour Party, there's a natural instinctive aversion to patriotism and you know, the nation and just, I think that there's a kind of old mixture of things around that. Obviously the legacy of empire, just the idea that we shouldn't be talking about nation at all, we should be talking about internationalism and so on. But I think you're absolutely right that for the vast majority of people, their national identity, that kind of instinctive feeling really of belonging to their country, is just a part of who they are. And you know, the little things like Keir. I mean, I think it was kind of late, sometime in January, Keir was visibly seen more with the the flag in the background. I think the leak happened in the memory. I think it was like the first day of February. So there's a bit of talk around it already, and then the leak happened, and I thought that it was, I looked at it and thought, absolutely right. Labour. It's well known that Labour is well behind on issues around the national interest. I've got some polling here that I'll bring up in a second, which shows how much work Labour's got to do in terms of overtaking the Tories in terms of who stands up for British interests. So I think there's, I think for most people, I think it shouldn't even be a question. It actually absolutely shouldn't be a question.
Isn't it odd though, Joe, that within the Labour movement itself, there is quite a contingent that have got a problem with it. Now, many of the Labour Party hark back to that 1945 Labour government as the best government, the best Labour's ever been. Well, let's remember, that Labour government essentially founded the Commonwealth. As the empire was being dismantled, they found the Commonwealth. It was Bevin that ensured we were tied to the hip with the United States in NATO and in our nuclear weapons program. It was, depending on your point of view, it was Clem Attlee that, and that Labour government that stopped us going into the coal and steel community. It was that Labour government that ultimately won the end of the Second World War with the defeat of Japan. And going back a little bit earlier, the Labour Party, in perhaps its most patriotic moment in its history, brought down the Chamberlain government and put Churchill in and formed that national coalition that beat the Nazis. So why we have this issue, and many of our MPs now, have served in uniform. Many former Labour leaders have. Attlee was a major after the war. You had in the Wilson government, Jim Callaghan, the former Prime Minister, was in the Navy. Dennis Healy, who was Chancellor, was in the Army, fought in Italy. And in the Parliament now, you've got Dan Jervis, who's also Mayor of Barnsley. I think it's Barnsley or the Barnsley metropolitan area. He was a paratrooper. And Clive Lewis was a territorial. So what's the problem with military, with patriotism, and with our role in the world and our institutions? It's part of the Labour Party.
You've summed it up. It is part of the Labour Party. It's part of our history. It's part of who we are. And the sense of the progressive nation is a massive part of who we are. So the statistic I drew out a second ago that I was getting at was that 46% think that Boris Johnson will stand up for Britain's interests, and only 30% think Keir Starmer will. Now, that's not a criticism of Keir. I think that's a Labour Party issue that has to be dealt with. So I think it's, to be honest with you, Brendan, I think there's a lot of noise on Twitter, but actually, even within the Labour movement, if you go into CLPs around the country, I think there'll be support for this and people understand this. I really do, because I think we absolutely need to show ourselves as a party for Britain's interests and values as well. So I think, I think that was, so that there was that kind of period, wasn't there? There was a debate around that, which I thought Labour moved into a kind of positive direction on. And then there was the stuff, as we move forward into March, there was the debates around the budget and around business. And Keir made an effort there, I think, to show that Labour is a party of growth and jobs and business. And this is a similar, thing within the Labour Party of how far do you go in that direction. But I think Labour is absolutely the party of enterprise and the party of business and the party of growth. That's how we create jobs, create better jobs, working with business to grow the economy. Of course, you need to challenge business at times as well, work with the trade unions together and do that. But ultimately, I think patriotic and pro-business, two things where we've seen the polling on the economy and on patriotism, we were 20 points behind at the time of last election. So the work we have to do on each of those issues is absolutely critical. And I think the budget, we slightly tied ourselves in knots around corporation tax, but the point is that we were trying to send a message that this is not the time to hit businesses, and I think that message whether we got that right on corporation tax or not is a tricky one, but that overall message is absolutely critical.
I totally agree, Joe. And something that I think Keir is absolutely right to be doing right now is positioning Labour as the party of small business, family businesses as well. And I know there are many in the Labour movement that regard the word profit and private enterprise as sort of devilish words that should be eradicated. But the fact of the matter is this: the more money you take out of individuals' hands and businesses' hands, the less money a business has to employ someone else. And if the more money you take out of an individual's hand, the less money they have to spend on the economy. And if you tax businesses to high heaven and take every penny you can, they're not going to expand, they're not going to invest, and they're not going to employ new people. Of course, government needs to take some money from business, but the government shouldn't be sitting there thinking, oh, what can we squeeze out of people today? It should be sitting there thinking, what can we do to make it easier for business to operate, to employ more people, to grow the economy? Now, I know there'll be some listening to this podcast having palpitations at the prospect of listening to this, but it's true.
I will challenge you a little bit on that, Brendan, and say that our corporation tax is still the lowest in Europe by quite some way, and that does need to go back up because otherwise you can end up in a race to the bottom. And also that growing businesses is important, but it's also how we grow them, where we want that growth to take place. And I think bringing kind of people and planet as well as alongside profit is key reporting reporting requirements. Making sure business is going in the right direction. I think all of that has got to be part of it, rather than but I think it's got to be part of a strategy, is what you're saying. It's got to be part of like a bigger strategy about what we want to do to grow the economy, how we can help businesses to grow, which doesn't just have a kind of knee-jerk, let's see how much we can rinse out of people, because that's when you get into the position where you're seen as a party which is anti-business, which Labour, again, historically, when we've done well, particularly last time we did well, we were seen to be on the side of growing the economy and wealth creators. So, I think, I broadly agree.
No, I broadly agree with you there, Joe. I mean, I suppose I was being a little bit gung-ho there, but I think it's we had, didn't we, under Miliband, and there was an extent to this. He used the language of predatory capitalism. And, John McDonnell, when he was Shadow Chancellor, spoke of going into the city and telling them what we're going to be doing. And that approach it's so them and us. It should be, we're one country, we're one people, whether you like it or not. We're outside the EU now. We've got to make a success of it. And if you have two sides, unions and workers and business fighting each other, you're never going to have a successful country and an economy. You're absolutely right. We've got to have them working together. And there are things that Labour could champion. I mean, the government have said, for example, that they are going to be looking at regulation. Now we're outside the EU. Now, I know, again, a lot of our people will be very frightened about this, but just look at this pandemic. There have been some regulations lifted on business which have actually been beneficial to us all. More firms can home deliver. There are pubs and restaurants in my area, there probably are in your area as well, that could never home deliver before. Well, now they can. And people quite like it. So not all deregulation is scary. Some of it's good. And I think Labour needs to adopt a more pragmatic approach to the economy, to business, to regulation, and not so much of an ideological one. Because we're in a world now where we're a digital world, we're a remote world. That's probably going to stay. And people quite like it. And so we need to adapt as a party to these new circumstances.
Sure. And I think that was a good story being told. And we won't repeat it again because we talked about it earlier around the foundations of the economy.
Yeah.
This was around the budget and the story around those foundations being ruptured by the Tories with the offsourcing and the offshoring. So I think we had a good story that I think we really need to build on. And Rachel Reeves keeps coming up with these conversations. She has a great piece in the New Statesman recently about that national story about the Tories' failings on the economy. Moving into local elections, it feels a little bit like we've gone back to talking about the NHS quite a lot and public sector pay rises, which is all really, really, really important. 100% key key workers deserve a pay rise. The NHS staff, social care staff, all deserve a pay rise. But that is only a small percent. Is it about a quarter of the population? I think it's less than that employed in those jobs. So a wider story about the failings on the economy, I think, would be a strong move going forward. And I think the other, one of the things I'd end on saying, because we're kind of getting to where we are now in terms of time, we worked through the whole year, is that I think it's crucial that when we pick our messages, that we absolutely hammer them for a bit. We take something, we hammer it for a few months, not a week, not a few days. And I think on these issues that we're talking about around business, it's absolutely critical that we take some lines and we absolutely hammer them. And that's how Keir is going to make some inroads.
I totally agree. These elections are obviously taking place while the government are enjoying a bounce in the polls because the vaccine's being rolled out. And actually, politics aside, and take the Tories out of this, it's the NHS that is delivering the vaccine rollout. I've been summoned for my vaccine, haven't booked it yet, but I'm going to. It's the NHS that's done this. So well played to them. And the weather's getting better. The country's feeling better. There's a road out of this. And that's the sort of the landscape under which Labour's fighting these elections. I agree with you. Nurses' pay is important, but you're absolutely right. We need to be speaking to a much broader audience. As much as I want to see nurses' pay increase, there's not one council leader in this country that actually has the power to increase nurses' pay because local councils don't control the health service budget. We need to be talking about other areas of the community that have been decimated. I mean, youth service in this country probably no longer exists, yet we've got a young people's mental health crisis in the country. Why aren't we dealing with that? We've got a massive housing problem. And when the ban on evictions comes, the end of the ban on evictions comes in a few weeks, we're going to have a massive homelessness problem. So why aren't we talking more about the housing crisis? I know where I am. I know you're in London. I'm in the southeast. I mean, you need a couple of million quid here just to get a box room, don't you? Let alone a proper house. The state of our roads. I mean, down here in Kent, it's abysmal. Sometimes I fall in a pothole and need a ladder to get back out. It's terrible. So we need to have a broader message. I think, though, Joe, I've got to say this. These elections, we should not be contemplating holding the line or, hoping we don't have losses. We are 10 years into a Tory government. 120,000 plus people have died in the past month. We were in the middle of the worst recession since Napoleon's armies marched across Europe. We should not be discussing damage limitation or expectation management. This should be advance, advance, advance. And anything less isn't acceptable.
Yeah, no, I agree. My only caveat again is that this has been an extremely difficult period for Keir to be leader in. So I'm not sure it will be quite a referendum on his leadership so far in the same way that other local elections would be. So I think whatever happens, we're going to have to give him more time once he's out past the pandemic. He's out giving speeches, and I hope then we can kind of do a couple of things. Three things. One is pick the right message. Two is make that message a bit surprising, so that we actually get a bit of cut through and people start taking notice. I wouldn't expect Labour to be saying that. That's interesting. They have changed. And third is repetition. Absolutely repeat it. Just go with it for months and just really hammer it. And the same way the Tories do. The Tories are excellent at consistency of messaging and repeating that. So I would say if we can get those things right, whether or not whatever happens at these local elections, the next year will be about really getting the messages right, really repeating them, being a bit surprising. So I think in a year's time, hopefully, if we're doing this podcast again, we will be. And I hope that we can look back and kind of assess that as a kind of not just 6 months forward and 6 months of kind of stalling, but of kind of a whole year going forward by pushing those key messages we've been talking about.
Absolutely, Joe. Again, I'm a bit gung-ho. We've got to do well in these elections. I appreciate it's been difficult, but I think this is also a test of how local Labour councils have got on in this election. A lot of Labour councils have done very good work. in supporting their communities throughout the pandemic, in organising food parcels and all sorts of other things. So this will be a good test for that as well. But we will be doing this podcast in a year. And one of the things we hope is, this is a discussion. We're not rivals, we're not enemies, and we hope our listeners will engage with this in a constructive way. I don't want to see any abuse, because that's not what the Labour Party is about. If you disagree with us, you can say so and tell us what you think instead. But no abuse, nothing like that. We are entitled to our opinions. We're all in one party here. And I would also just say to all Labour members, there is a system called dialogue. When I first went on it, I couldn't stand it. But it's there for all Labour members and supporters to be phone banking and phone canvassing for the May elections. We can't go out and do normal campaigning, so they should all get on the phones from home, from the comfort of their armchairs, and support the party in the May elections. I'm doing some tomorrow morning. No, I know you will be. Elections where you are as well. So yeah, it's hopefully we'll be able to do another series and keep this going, and we'll see what happens in May.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Joe.
We'll see you again next time.